The land breathed dust and heat. In the year of our Lord 1870, the territory of the Southwest was a place of raw, unfinished beauty, a canvas on which God had painted with a bold and unforgiving hand. The sun was a hammer, beating down from a sky so vast and blue it could make a man feel like an insect. It baked the earth into a cracked mosaic of red clay and pale sand, from which sprang the hardiest of life's skeletal ocotillo, thorny cholla, and the great silent saguaros that stood like sentinels, their arms raised in prayer or surrender. This was a world of sharp edges and stark contrasts. Mountains of crimson rock clawed at the sky, their sides scarred by canyons carved over millennia by water that was now just a memory, a ghost that whispered through dry riverbeds. Yet, life persisted. In the higher elevations, sparse forests of juniper and piñón pine clung to the slopes, their evergreen scent a sharp, clean counterpoint to the dusty air of the basin. And threading through this harshness were lifelines, rivers and streams that cut through the rock, their banks lined with cottonwoods that shimmered like a mirage, their rushing water the only true music in a land of profound silence. Here, two worlds collided. The white settlers, the pioneers, came with their wagons and their Bibles, their plows and their fences. They tried to tame the land, to draw straight lines and square parcels onto a landscape that had never known them. Their cabins of rough-hewn timber were defiant little specks of order against a backdrop of magnificent chaos. Their lives were a cycle of back-breaking labor, of prayer and perseverance, ruled by the sun and the seasons and the constant, gnawing fear of drought, raids, and the sheer, overwhelming loneliness of the frontier. And then there were the Apache, the ND, the people, to them. This land was not an enemy to be conquered, but a mother to be understood. They did not draw lines on it. Their boundaries were the rivers, the mountains, the migratory paths of the buffalo. They moved with the seasons, their lives an intricate dance of survival and freedom. They knew the secret places where water seeped from solid rock, the herbs that could soothe a fever, and the silence that spoke of an approaching enemy. Their existence was as harsh as the settlers, but it was a life of fierce, untamed liberty. In this world of struggle and freedom lived a man who was a legend among his own people, and a ghost story whispered around the settlers' campfires. His name was Bodaway. He was not a chief by birthright, but a leader by the sheer force of his will and the weight of his reputation. Among the Apache, where a man's wealth was measured in horses, Bodaway was a king. His herd was a sprawling, magnificent tapestry of color and muscle bays, pintos, Appaloosas, and shimmering black stallions, all bred for speed, endurance, and intelligence. They were his pride, a testament to his skill as a horseman and his cunning as a raider in his younger days. Bodaway was a man forged from the very elements of the land he called home. He was tall, his frame lean and corded with the muscle of a life lived in motion. His face was a landscape of its own, weathered by sun and wind, with high cheekbones and a jaw that seemed carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held the true measure of the man. They were dark and deep, and in their depths lay the stillness of a mountain pool and the glint of obsidian. They saw everything, revealed little, and held a silence that was older than words. He moved with a liquid grace that belied his size, whether on foot tracking a deer or astride one of his prize stallions, seeming less a rider on a horse and more a single, unified creature of speed and power. He lived alone, not in a traditional wickiup, but in a cabin. It was another thing that set him apart. He had built it himself, years ago, in a hidden valley protected on three sides by sheer rock walls. It was a fortress, constructed of thick ponderosa pine logs, chinked so tightly not even the winter wind could find a way inside. It was far larger than any one man needed, with a strong roof of sod and a wide stone chimney that rose against the cliff face like a defiant fist. A spring-fed creek ran nearby, providing clear, cold water. and the valley floor was lush with grass for his horses. It was a place of perfect solitude and unassailable security. To be invited inside Bodaway's cabin was an honor few had ever been granted. The interior was a reflection of its owner's complex soul. It was a space of masculine order and surprising wealth. On one wall hung his weapons, each one a masterpiece of deadly function. There was a Winchester repeating rifle, its brass receiver gleaming in the firelight, a prize from a long-ago skirmish. Beside it hung his Apache warbow, made of seasoned Osage orange wood, and a quiver of arrows fletched with eagle feathers, their flint and steel heads honed to a razor's edge. Lances and a war shield decorated with sacred symbols completed the display. The floor was covered with thick pelts buffalo, wolf, and beaver, making the space warm and quiet. Blankets woven by Navajo masters, traded for with his finest horses, were folded in neat stacks or draped over the simple wooden bed frame he had built into the wall. These blankets were riots of color, geometric patterns of red, black, and white that spoke of a world of art and tradition. In a corner, there were signs of trade with the world beyond sacks of flour and beans, tins of coffee, and a small, intricately carved wooden chest that held a few silver conchos and a turquoise necklace he had won in a gamble. Everything had its place. His cooking implements hung by the great stone hearth. His tools for leatherworking and arrow-making were laid out on a rough-hewn table, and his few articles of clothing were stored in a sturdy pine chest. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, oiled leather, and the faint, clean scent of the sage he sometimes burned to clear the air. It was the scent of self-sufficiency, of a man who needed nothing and no one. Yet, as the sun bled out behind the western peaks and the sky deepened to a bruised purple, a different feeling settled over the cabin. The fire in the hearth would crackle and spit, casting long, dancing shadows that played across the log walls. Bodaway would sit on a buffalo robe before the flames. His meal of roasted venison and corn cakes finished, the world outside would fall silent, save for the yip of a distant coyote or the hoot of an owl. It was in these hours that the fortress became a prison, the solitude a profound loneliness. The cabin felt too big. The silence within its walls was different from the peaceful quiet of the wilderness. It was a heavy, hollow silence that echoed the emptiness inside him. He was a man of immense strength and discipline. He had trained his body to endure impossible hardship, his mind to be sharp and calculating in the heat of battle. He had faced down soldiers, bears, and starvation. He commanded the respect of his people and the fear of his enemies, fathers of his tribe. Men with wealth and standing had approached him, offering their daughters in marriage. They spoke of alliances, of combining herds, of strong sons to carry on his name. He had refused them all, politely but firmly, his rejections as solid and unmovable as the mountains that sheltered his valley. It wasn't that he scorned companionship, but the arrangements proposed were transactions, matters of property and lineage. He saw the shy, downcast eyes of the young women presented to him and felt nothing. They were good women, strong and capable, but their spirits did not call to his own spirit. The fierce, untamed thing that lived behind his silent eyes remained untouched, unheard. He was waiting. He did not know what for. It was a nameless ache, a hunger that no amount of food or success could satisfy. It was a space inside him, as vast and empty as the desert sky at midnight. He had mastered his world, had bent it to his will through strength and intelligence. He had wealth, power, and freedom. By any measure, he was a man who had everything. But as he stared into the hypnotic dance of the flames, his shadow a silent giant on the wall behind him. Bodaway knew the truth. His strength was a wall he had built around himself, his discipline a cage for his own heart. He longed for a connection that went beyond words and traditions, a meeting of two souls that would be as wild and elemental as a thunderstorm breaking over the desert. He craved a kindred spirit, someone whose fire would match his own, not to be controlled or possessed, but to burn alongside his. He rose and walked to the heavy door. Pulling it open, the night air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. A sliver of moon hung in the star-dusted sky, casting a pale, ethereal light over his valley. His horses murmured softly in their corral, their dark shapes shifting in the gloom. He was the master of all he surveyed, a king in his own solitary kingdom. And yet, the wind that rustled the cottonwood leaves by the creek seemed to whisper a single, melancholic word, asterisk alone, asterisk. The strongest of men still had a void in his heart, a space kept empty, waiting for a destiny he couldn't yet imagine. Miles away from Bodaway's solitary kingdom, yet under the same unforgiving sun, lay a different kind of life. It was a life carved out of the wilderness, not with the fluid grace of the Apache, but with the grim, square-jawed determination of the settler. This was the Monroe homestead, a small, defiant rectangle of human will pressed against the edge of an untamed world. A split-rail fence, its wood already bleaching to silver under the relentless sun, marked the boundary between their tilled earth and the vast, untroubled wilderness beyond. Inside this enclosure stood a cabin built of logs, the gaps plugged with a mixture of mud and moss, a testament to the hard labor of a single man. Jedediah Monroe. Life here had a rhythm dictated by necessity. The day began before the sun, with the crowing of the rooster and the lowing of the family's single milk cow. It was a world of relentless chores, a litany of tasks that were the price of survival. The air smelled of wood smoke from the cook stove, the sharp tang of manure from the small barn, the earthy scent of the cornfield, and the clean, starchy smell of laundry boiling in a great black kettle. It was a life of straight lines and sharp corners, the rows of corn, the edges of the fence, the rigid moral code of the Holy Bible that sat on a small shelf by the hearth. Within this small, ordered world lived Eliza Monroe. She had just passed her 18th year, a young woman poised on the precipice of a life that had already been laid out for her. She was beautiful, but it was a quiet, unassuming beauty, like that of a wildflower discovered in the shade of a great oak. Her hair was the color of sun-bleached corn silk, usually plaited and pinned beneath a practical bonnet. Her skin, protected from the sun's harsh glare, was fair and dusted with a constellation of faint freckles across her nose. But her most striking feature was her eyes. They were a clear, startling blue, the color of the desert sky after a rainstorm. In their depths, one could see the innocence of her youth, the piety of her upbringing, and something else, a flicker of restlessness, a silent, unasked question. Eliza was the model of a dutiful daughter. Her hands, though slender, were capable and calloused from churning butter, kneading dough, mending clothes, and tending the small vegetable garden that was her mother's pride. She moved through her days with a quiet grace, her voice soft, her demeanor respectful. She honored her father, Jedediah, a stern, God-fearing man whose face was a roadmap of hardship and whose hands were thick and powerful from years of wielding an axe and a plow. She obeyed her mother, Martha, a woman worn thin by work and worry, whose love was expressed not in gentle words but in ensuring her daughter knew how to run a household and be a proper wife. A woman's hands must never be idle. Eliza, Martha would say, her fingers never stopping their work on a quilt square. Idleness is the devil's workshop. You remember that when you have a home of your own. A home of her own. The words were meant to be a promise, a comfort, but for Eliza, they felt like the closing of a door. That home, everyone knew, was meant to be with Silas Blackwood. Silas's family owned the neighboring claim, a full day's ride away. He was a good man. Of that there was no doubt. He was 25, strong as an ox, with a shock of sandy hair and a shy, earnest smile. He was a hard worker, and his land was prosperous. He was, as her father often said with a nod of satisfaction, a fine prospect. Just last Sunday, after the traveling preacher had delivered his sermon in the Blackwood's large barn. Jedediah had clapped Silas on the shoulder. "Heard you raised a new smokehouse? Son, a man who plans for the future is a man the Lord smiles upon." Silas had blushed, his eyes darting toward Eliza. "Just trying to build something that lasts, Mr. Monroe." Eliza had offered a small, polite smile, her hands clutching her Bible. She saw the meaning that passed between the two men, the silent, settled agreement. She looked at Silas, at his kind, simple face and his dirt-caked fingernails, and she tried to picture her future. She saw a life in a cabin much like this one, her hands chapped from lye soap, her back aching from childbirth and labor. She saw a cycle of planting and harvesting, of darning her husband's socks and praying for rain. It was a good life, a respectable life, the only life she was supposed to want, and the thought of it suffocated her, filling her with a quiet, desperate panic that she quickly pushed down with a prayer, ashamed of her own ungrateful heart. She felt trapped between two versions of herself. There was the dutiful daughter, the pious girl who read her scriptures and believed in the righteous path set before her. She loved her parents and understood the sacrifices they had made. She knew that their desire for her to marry Silas was born of love, of a need to see her safe and secure in a world that was anything but. To defy them would be to break their hearts, to fly in the face of God's own plan. But there was another Eliza, a secret self that lived in the silent spaces of her heart. This Eliza yearned for something more, though she could not give it a name. This version of her came alive when she looked past the rail fence, past the neat rows of corn, to the distant, hazy mountains that rose like jagged blue giants against the horizon. They seemed to beckon to her, promising a world larger than her own, a world of mystery and untamed beauty. What was on the other side? What did it feel like to stand on their peaks and see the world spread out below? The thought was a thrilling, terrifying whisper. She would read passages in the Bible about wandering in the wilderness, and instead of seeing it as a trial, she would imagine the freedom of it, the feeling of having no fences, no walls, no path but the one you made yourself. This internal war, this clash of duty and desire, found its only release in the late afternoon. When the sun was at its most punishing and the air was thick with heat, a lull would fall over the homestead. Her father would be napping in the shade of the porch, and her mother would be resting her feet. This was Eliza's time. "I'm going to check the berry patches by the creek, Mama," she would say, her voice calm and even. Martha would nod, barely opening her eyes. "Don't you wander too far. You hear and keep an eye out for snakes." "Yes, Mama," with a basket in her hand as a prop. Eliza would slip out of the oppressive quiet of the cabin and into the shimmering heat. She would walk quickly past the barn, past the edge of the cornfield, until she reached the gate of the rail fence. Unlatching it, she would step through, and as the gate closed behind her, the weight on her shoulders would begin to lift. She was crossing a border, leaving the world of man and entering the world of nature. The forest here was not dense, but a scattered woodland of oak and mesquite that offered dappled shade. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and wild things. The sounds of the homestead, the clucking chickens, the clang of the hammer faded, replaced by the buzz of insects, the call of a mourning dove, and the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Here, she could finally breathe. Her destination was a place she considered her own, a sanctuary she had discovered months ago. It was a small, secluded cove along the creek, hidden by a thick stand of willows and a tumble of smooth, sun-warmed boulders. The water here pooled, running clear and deep over a sandy bottom before narrowing and hurrying on its way. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of leaves, scattering diamonds across the water's surface. It was a place of profound peace, a church without walls. This was where the secret Eliza lived. She would set down her basket and untie the ribbons of her bonnet. Letting it fall to the grass, she would shake her head, allowing the breeze, a real and untamed wind, to run its fingers through her pinned-up hair. She would slip off her heavy, dusty boots and stockings and dip her bare feet into the shockingly cold water, gasping at the clean, thrilling sensation. Here, she wasn't a daughter or a future wife. She wasn't a set of responsibilities or a list of chores. She was just a soul, a living thing in a living world. She would sit on a flat rock, her skirt tucked around her, and simply watch and listen. She saw the way a dragonfly, with its wings of iridescent lace, hovered over the water. She watched a small lizard doing push-ups on a sunlit rock. She heard the symphony of the creek as it gurgled and whispered its way over the stones. In this place, her restless heart grew calm. The gnawing anxiety about her future would recede, replaced by a sense of belonging that she never felt inside the four walls of her home. She felt a kinship with the wildness around her, a connection to its untamable spirit. It was in these stolen hours that she felt most truly herself, most alive. But as the sun began to dip lower, casting long, golden fingers of light through the trees, a familiar melancholy would return. She knew this freedom was temporary, a borrowed moment. Soon she would have to put on her boots, tie on her bonnet, and walk back through the gate, back to the world of straight lines and expectations. One late afternoon, as the heat lingered in the air, she stayed longer than usual, mesmerized by the play of light on the water. She leaned over the pool and looked at her reflection. She saw her own familiar face, but the water rippled, distorting her features. For a moment, she saw the eyes of a stranger looking back a woman she did not know, a woman whose face was not marked by quiet obedience, but by a fierce and unknown freedom. The image was gone as quickly as it came, but the feeling lingered. The stolen moments were no longer enough. A deep, powerful current of longing was rising within her, pulling her toward a destiny she could not see, a collision of worlds she could never have imagined. The heat of the day had finally broken. A soft, golden light, the kind that only happens in the hour before dusk, slanted through the trees, turning the dust motes in the air into a glittering haze. For Eliza, this light was a benediction. It was a sign that her stolen time was drawing to a close, but it also painted her sanctuary in colors so beautiful they made her heart ache. The creek whispered its eternal secrets as it flowed over the stones. Today, the call of the water was stronger than ever. The dust of the homestead clung to her skin, a gritty film of duty and confinement. The layers of her dress the practical cotton. The stiff petticoat felt heavy and suffocating, a uniform she was forced to wear. She looked at the pool, at the way the light danced on its clear surface, inviting and pure. An impulse, wild and daring, rose within her. It was a thought so foreign to the dutiful Eliza Munro that it made her cheeks flush. Yet it felt as natural as breathing. She wanted to feel the water not just on her feet, but everywhere. She wanted to wash away the day, the dust, the weariness, and, for a few precious moments, to be as free and unburdened as the dragonfly skimming the surface. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her propriety. She glanced around, her senses on high alert. The woods were silent save for the drone of insects and the murmur of the creek. She was utterly alone. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she began to unfasten the buttons at the back of her dress. The fabric sighed as it fell away, pooling around her ankles. Next came the petticoat, the chemise, until she stood in the dappled sunlight, clad only in the soft, pale skin of her youth. A breeze, cool and gentle, kissed her shoulders, raising goosebumps. It was the first time in her life she had felt the open air against her bare skin, and the sensation was one of shocking, profound liberation. She was no longer Jedediah's daughter, or Silas's intended, or a cog in the machinery of the homestead. She was simply a part of this wild, sun-drenched place. Hesitantly, she took a step toward the water's edge, Then another. The sand was soft beneath her feet. She waded in, the cold water a sharp, clean shock that stole her breath. It swirled around her ankles, her calves, her knees, a bracing embrace. She laughed, the sound startling in the quiet woods. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, a sound the girl in the starched bonnet rarely made. She submerged herself completely, the water rushing over her, silencing the world. When she came up, gasping and sputtering, her hair was a dark, heavy weight on her back, and the world seemed new and bright. She floated on her back, her eyes closed, feeling the sun warm her face and the current gently tugging at her limbs. In this moment, she was weightless, timeless, and completely, blissfully free. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Bodaway moved through the forest with a silence that was absolute. He was not walking on the land, but was a part of its rhythm, his moccasins making no more sound on the dry leaves and pine needles than a passing shadow. He was miles from his cabin, on a long, looping patrol of his territory's eastern edge, a routine he followed with the same discipline that governed every other aspect of his life. His senses were fully alive, attuned to the nuances of the wilderness. He noted the fresh tracks of a doe and her fawn, the agitated chatter of a squirrel that signaled a hawk circling overhead, the faint, dusty scent of a fox that had passed this way hours ago. It was a sound that stopped him. It was faint at first, carried on the breeze, and it did not belong. It wasn't the cry of a bird or the rustle of an animal. It was the sound of splashing water, followed by a peal of laughter. The sound was high and clear, like a silver bell ringing in the quiet woods. It was a human sound, but it held none of the caution or fear of a settler who knew they were in Apache territory. It was a sound of pure, unguarded joy. Curiosity, a feeling he rarely indulged, stirred within him. His body tensed, every instinct honed by years of survival taking over. He moved from the cover of a juniper to the shadow of a great boulder, his movements economical and fluid. The sound grew clearer as he neared the creek. He slipped behind the thick trunk of a cottonwood, its bark rough against his shoulder, and peered through the screen of willow branches. And then he saw her. The world, for a single, suspended heartbeat, ceased to exist. The buzzing insects, the whispering leaves, the flow of the creek, all of it faded into a profound silence. All that existed was the scene before him, a woman in the water, her skin as pale as the inside of a seashell against the dark pool. The setting sun had turned the water to liquid gold, and this light seemed to cling to her, outlining the gentle curve of her shoulders and the long, elegant line of her back. Her hair, dark with water, fanned out around her head like a silken halo. She was laughing again, a soft, private sound as she kicked her feet, sending a spray of glittering droplets into the air. Bodaway felt it like a physical blow, an arrow to the center of his chest. It was not lust. He had known desire, the simple, uncomplicated fire of the body. This was different. This was an earthquake in the bedrock of his soul. The hollow space inside him, the vast, silent emptiness he carried in his fortress of solitude, was suddenly, violently filled. It was as if he had been walking through his entire life in a gray, colorless world, and had just now, for the first time, seen color. He watched, motionless, as she moved in the water with an innocent, unself-conscious grace. She was not a settler woman to be feared or fought. She was not an Apache maiden to be bartered for. She was something else entirely. She was a spirit of the water, a manifestation of the wild, untamed beauty he understood better than any human society. The sight of her, so free and joyful in her solitude, resonated with the deepest part of his own lonely spirit. It was the answer to a question he had never known how to ask. The ache of his loneliness was replaced by a fierce, possessive certainty that was as absolute as the rising of the sun. Asterisk, mine asterisk. The word was not a thought, but a conviction that settled into his very bones. This was what he had been waiting for. This was his destiny, delivered to him by the spirits of the land itself. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A sudden chill ran over Eliza's skin, one that had nothing to do with the cooling water. The joy of a moment before evaporated, replaced by a primal, prickling sense of unease. The hairs on her arms stood on end. The woods, which had felt like a welcoming sanctuary, now seemed to hold its breath. The shadows under the trees deepened, seeming to conceal 100 watching eyes. She was being watched. She froze, treading water, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat of fear. Slowly, she turned her head, scanning the dense foliage along the creek bank. At first, she saw nothing but the familiar patterns of leaves and branches. Then, her eyes snagged on something that did not belong. A shape, darker than the shadows, standing with an unnatural stillness behind the trunk of a massive cottonwood. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was a man, an Indian, an Apache. Everything her father had ever told her, every whispered story she had heard around the fire about savage raids and stolen women, coalesced into a single, blinding wave of terror. He was tall, his silhouette framed by the setting sun, making it impossible to see his face clearly. But she could see the formidable breadth of his shoulders, the rifle held loosely in one hand, the unnerving stillness that was more menacing than any sudden movement. He was a predator, and she was his discovered prey. A scream, thin and strangled, tore from her throat. The idyllic scene shattered into a million pieces of nightmare. Modesty, piety, all the lessons of her life were consumed by a single, overwhelming instinct flight. She scrambled through the water toward the bank where she had left her clothes, the water that had felt so liberating now seeming to drag at her limbs, holding her back. She stumbled out of the creek, gasping and sobbing, her bare feet slipping on the wet stones. She snatched at her dress, a useless piece of fabric, holding it in front of her like a shield. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She ran, her only thought to get back to the fence, back to the cabin, back to the safety of her small, predictable world. The forest floor was a torment to her bare feet. Twigs and sharp stones cut into her soft soles. Thorny branches clawed at her skin, leaving fiery red lines on her arms and legs. Her lungs burned, and her panicked sobs came in ragged, desperate gasps. The sound of pursuit was terrifyingly soft. It was not the clumsy crashing of a white man. It was a rhythmic, almost silent padding, the sound of footsteps that were as much a part of the woods as the falling leaves. It was impossibly fast, impossibly close. He wasn't running, he was flowing over the terrain, a relentless shadow consuming the distance between them. The clash of their two worlds had happened. The hunter had found his quarry. The man who had been waiting for destiny had found it in the form of a girl who was now fleeing from it in mortal terror. The quiet order of her life and the solitary discipline of his had just collided in a moment of sunlight and water, and the quiet woods would never be the same. Panic is a fire in the blood. For Eliza, it consumed everything, burning away thought, reason, and prayer, leaving only the raw, animal instinct to run. The world was a blur of greens and browns, a rushing, hostile tunnel of vegetation. The air she sucked into her lungs was ragged and painful, each breath a searing reminder of her failing strength. Her bare feet, which had danced with such delight in the cool sand by the creek, were now instruments of agony. Every step was a fresh torment, a sharp stone, a jabbing root, the needle-like prick of a thorn. She no longer felt them as individual pains, but as a single, throbbing fire that shot up her legs. Her dress, still damp, clung to her limbs like a shroud, tangling around her knees, threatening to trip her with every desperate stride. She clutched the fabric at her chest, a pathetic shield against the eyes she could feel boring into her back. The forest, her once peaceful sanctuary, had turned against her. Branches that had offered gentle shade now whipped at her face and arms like thorny lashes. The calls of the birds were no longer a melody but a screeching alarm, mocking her flight. Every rustle of leaves was the sound of his approach, every shadow a phantom reaching for her. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, hopeless sound that was swallowed by the indifferent woods. Her mind was a maelstrom of terror, replaying the image of the man by the creek, the Apache, the savage from the campfire stories, the dark, silent figure who had watched her in her most vulnerable moment. She didn't know what he wanted, but the whispers and warnings of her people supplied the horrifying answers. Her life, the simple, predictable, suffocating life she had so desperately wished to escape, now seemed a paradise lost, a heaven she would give anything to return to. The straight lines of the fence, the solid walls of the cabin, they were no longer a prison, but a fortress she could not reach. She risked a glance over her shoulder. It was a mistake. He was not far behind, and the sight of him stole what little air remained in her lungs. He wasn't running so much as gliding, his powerful legs eating up the ground with an effortless, terrifying grace. He flowed through the trees and over the uneven terrain as if it were a flat, open plain. There was no sign of exertion on his face, only a look of focused, unyielding intensity. He was not a man chasing her. He was a force of nature, as relentless as a river, as inevitable as the setting sun. And he was getting closer. The knowledge sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through her, and she pushed her punished body harder, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. She was no longer running toward home. She was simply running away from him, plunging deeper into a wilderness she did not know. Bodaway watched her run. He saw the wild terror in her eyes, the way her pale skin was scratched and bleeding, the agony on her face as her bare feet met the unforgiving earth. A part of him, the disciplined warrior, the man of honor, felt a discordant pang. This was not the way. A warrior's strength was for battle, for protecting his people, not for running down a terrified, unarmed girl. It was a dishonorable chase. The spirits would not look kindly on a man who brought such fear to a creature of such spirit. But a deeper, more primal force overruled him. It was the absolute conviction that had seized him by the creek. This was not a raid. He was not taking a captive for ransom or work. He was claiming what the universe had just shown him was his. He had lived his life in solitude, waiting for a sign, for a soul that mirrored the wildness in his own. He had seen it in her, in that moment of pure, uninhibited joy. That was the woman he was chasing, not this panicked, fleeing creature. He had to possess the one to find the other. He knew he could have closed the distance in a dozen strides, ended the chase in an instant, but he held back, pacing her, allowing the forest and her own exhaustion to do the work for him. There was a grim purpose in this. He needed her to understand the futility of escape. He needed her to understand that her world was gone, and that the only reality now was him. The chase was the first, harsh lesson. Her fear was a regrettable but necessary consequence. It was a fire that would have to burn itself out, and from the ashes, he would find the spirit he had seen by the water. His mind was a battleground. The traditions of his people warred with the raw, undeniable command of his soul. Honor dictates you let her go. One voice said, she is a settler, an enemy. But the other voice, the new, powerful one that had awoken by the creek, was louder. She is not an enemy. She is your other half. To let her go is to die of thirst after finding the only spring in the desert. It is to go blind after seeing the sun. This conflict did not slow his pace. It hardened his resolve. He saw her stumble, her strength faltering. The end was near. He lengthened his stride. The time for waiting over. He would not be cruel, but he would be absolute. He would take what fate had offered, and he would never let it go. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Eliza's vision was starting to tunnel. The edges were dark and hazy, the world reduced to the treacherous patch of ground directly in front of her. Her legs were numb, moving on sheer momentum, no longer obeying the commands of her brain. Hope was a dying ember, smothered by the crushing weight of exhaustion and despair. She knew, with a certainty that was a cold sickness in the pit of her stomach, that she was not going to make it. The forest itself seemed to conspire against her, its gnarled roots reaching up from the earth like skeletal hands. One did just that. A thick, dark root, hidden beneath a layer of dead leaves, caught her foot. There was no time to react. Her ankle twisted violently, and a sharp, white-hot lance of pain shot up her leg. Her forward momentum carried her, off balance and helpless, through the air. She landed hard on the unforgiving ground, the impact driving the last of the air from her lungs in a choked gasp. For a moment, she lay there, stunned, the world spinning. The pain in her ankle was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the cold dread that washed over her. It was over. She tried to push herself up, to crawl, to do anything, but her body refused to obey. A shadow fell over her. She didn't need to look up to know he was there. She could feel his presence, a palpable weight in the air, a sudden stillness in the forest. Slowly, she forced her head up, her eyes wide with terror. He stood over her, his legs braced, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. His face, now visible in the fading light, was even more intimidating up close. It was a mask of hard angles and weathered bronze skin. His jaw tight, his mouth a grim, straight line, and his eyes they burned. They were dark and fierce, and they held an intensity that stripped her bare, seeing past her fear, past her clothing, past her very skin, and into the trembling core of her soul. He knelt, not with a sudden pounce, but with a deliberate, unhurried movement. Eliza flinched back, crab-crawling uselessly against the forest floor. He reached for her. "No." The word was a desperate plea, a sob. "Please don't touch me." His hand closed around her upper arm. His grip was like iron, strong and inescapable. Yet, surprisingly, it did not bruise. It simply held. With a single, fluid motion, he pulled her to her feet. She cried out as her injured ankle refused to take her weight, and she collapsed against him. The contact with his hard body sent a jolt of pure terror through her. He was solid and warm, smelling of leather, smoke, and the wild, clean scent of the pines. It was the smell of the world she had just lost. The animal instinct for survival surged through her one last time. She began to fight, twisting and struggling, beating her fists against his chest. "Let me go! Let me go!" she screamed, her voice hoarse with panic and exhaustion. He did not speak. He did not flinch. He stood like a man carved from the rock of the mountains, absorbing her frantic blows as if they were nothing more than the fluttering of a moth's wings. He simply held her, his grip unyielding, his silence a more profound and terrifying response than any threat could have been. He let her fight until her struggles became weaker, her fists losing their force, her screams dissolving into ragged, hopeless sobs. Her energy was spent. There was nothing left. When she was finally still, a limp, trembling weight against him, he shifted his hold, effortlessly, as if she weighed no more than a child. He swept her up into his arms. One arm curled securely beneath her knees, the other supported her back. Her head fell against his shoulder, her tear-streaked face turned towards the woods she had just run through. Without a word, he turned. He did not look back towards the direction of her home. He faced west, toward the deepening shadows and the rising mountains, and with a steady, relentless pace, he began to walk, carrying her away from everything she had ever known. The last of the golden sunlight faded from the sky, and the long, cold night of her new life began. The journey was a long, waking nightmare. Eliza drifted in and out of a state of numb shock, the world reduced to a series of fragmented sensations. The rhythmic, jarring motion of his stride, the coarse texture of his buckskin shirt against her cheek, the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her ear, a sound that should have been comforting but was instead the drumming of her doom. The night grew cold, and the darkness was absolute, a thick, black blanket that smothered the stars. She had no idea where they were going, only that every step took her further away from the light, further away from everything she had ever been. He moved with an unnerving confidence in the dark, navigating the treacherous terrain as if it were a familiar room in his own house. She could hear the soft scuff of his moccasins, the sigh of the wind through the pines, and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. She was too exhausted, too broken to fight anymore. She lay limp in his arms, a captured bird whose wings had been broken. Her only remaining defense, a retreat deep into the silent, terrified corners of her own mind. After what felt like an eternity, the terrain changed. The ground leveled out, and the air grew still. She heard the soft nicker of horses and the gentle, musical sound of running water. He had stopped. He set her down on her feet, but his hands remained on her arms, holding her steady as her injured ankle gave way. Before her loomed a dark, monolithic shape against the faint starlight. A building. It was a cabin, but it was unlike any she had ever seen. It was huge, built of massive, interlocking logs, looking less like a home and more like a blockhouse, a fortress built to withstand a siege. He pushed open a heavy wooden door that groaned on leather hinges and nudged her inside. Then he closed it, the sound of the heavy bar falling into place a definitive, soul-crushing thud. It was the sound of a cage door locking. The inside of the cabin was cast in the flickering, amber glow of dying embers in a massive stone hearth. As her eyes adjusted, the details of her prison slowly emerged from the shadows, and they were a profound and terrifying contradiction. One wall was an armory. A gleaming Winchester rifle hung beside a formidable Apache bow and a quiver of arrows. War lances and a painted shield added to the menacing display. The floor was a mosaic of thick, luxurious pelts, buffalo, bear, wolf that swallowed the sound of their footsteps. It was the den of a predator, filled with the tools and trophies of a violent life. Yet, there was another side to the room. The air smelled of wood smoke and leather, but also of something else, the clean, aromatic scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. By the hearth, a pot of coffee sat warming on the stones, and neatly stacked firewood promised warmth against the night. Folded on a heavy wooden chest were blankets of such vibrant color and intricate design that they took her breath away. It was a place of savage strength, but also of a strange, masculine order and an undeniable wealth. This was not the crude wickiup of a wandering raider. It was the seat of a king in his own solitary kingdom. He guided her to a stool by the fire and then knelt before her, his movements economical and precise. Eliza flinched, pulling away, expecting a blow. Instead, he reached for her injured foot. His hands, which she had expected to be rough and cruel, were surprisingly gentle as he examined the swollen, discolored ankle. He rose, went to a corner of the cabin, and returned with a strip of clean cloth and a small wooden bowl of dark, pungent-smelling salve. Without a word, he began to tend to her injury, his fingers probing the tender flesh with a practiced skill that was both unnerving and, to her shame, a small relief from the throbbing pain. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire as he added a fresh log. The sight of this man, this savage, her captor tending to her with such quiet focus, was a disorienting assault on her terror. It made no sense. He had hunted her down like an animal, and now he was mending the injuries she had sustained in her flight. Her fear began to curdle with a desperate, bewildered confusion. She had to know, she had to hear a voice, even if it was a voice that condemned her. Her own voice, when it came, was a dry, cracking whisper. "Why? He did not look up from his work, his hands continuing to wrap her ankle with the clean cloth. She swallowed, forcing more strength into her words. "Why did you bring me here?" He finished tying the knot on the bandage, his work precise and final. Then he raised his head, and his dark eyes met hers. The firelight played across the hard planes of his face, making his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a burning, unwavering certainty. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and deep, not a shout or a threat, but a simple, profound statement of an undeniable truth. "Because you are mine." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They were so simple, so absolute, so utterly devoid of doubt. They were the key that unlocked the floodgates of her despair. The last fragile thread of hope that she might be ransomed, that this was some terrible mistake, snapped. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "No, I am not yours." Her voice rose, gaining a hysterical edge. "I am Eliza Monroe. My father is Jedediah Monroe. He will come for me. He will bring men, soldiers. You have to let me go." She began to sob, the tears she had held back during the long, terrifying journey now streaming down her face. "Please," she begged, the words tearing from her raw throat. "I want to go home. Please, just let me go home." She collapsed into herself, her body racked with deep, shuddering sobs of pure, hopeless grief. This was it, the end of her world. She would die here, in this dark, wild place, the possession of a savage. Bodaway remained silent, watching her. He did not move to comfort her, nor did he show any sign of anger or impatience. He simply let her cry, his stillness a rock against which the waves of her despair crashed and broke. He let the storm of her grief rage until it had exhausted itself, until her sobs quieted into hiccuping, shuddering breaths. When she was finally spent, a hollow, trembling shell of herself, he rose. She flinched again, expecting him to finally unleash the violence she had been anticipating. But he walked past her to the heavy wooden chest where the colorful blankets lay. He picked up not a blanket, but a simple comb carved from bone. He came back and stood behind her. Before she could react, he reached out and gently took hold of her hair. It was a tangled, matted mess, full of twigs and leaves from her flight through the forest. With his other hand, he began to comb it. The sensation was so shocking, so utterly bizarre, that it stunned her into silence. His movements were slow and methodical. He started at the ends, patiently working through the knots, his touch firm but not painful. The rhythmic pull of the comb through her hair was a strange, intimate act. It was an act of grooming, of ownership, of care. It was a gesture so profoundly at odds with the terror of her capture that her mind could not process it. A captor did not do this. A savage did not do this. Her tears stopped. Her body went rigid. A new kind of fear, a fear of the unknown, of this incomprehensible tenderness taking hold. He was untangling her hair, but it felt as if he were untangling her very soul, reordering it to his own design. The gesture silenced her more effectively than any threat. It was a quiet declaration that her former life, with its simple braids and bonnets, was over. Her very person was now his to tend to order, to possess. He finished, her hair now falling in a clean, smooth curtain down her back. He placed the comb on the stool beside her and moved back to the fire, taking his seat on a buffalo robe as if nothing had happened. The spell was broken. Eliza scrambled away from him, to the furthest, darkest corner of the cabin, pulling a heavy bearskin pelt around her shoulders like a shield. The hours passed in a thick, humming silence. He offered her food, a piece of roasted meat and a flat corn cake on a wooden plate, but she refused, shaking her head, unable to swallow past the lump of terror in her throat. Eventually, the fire burned low again, casting long, monstrous shadows that danced on the log walls. The night outside was absolute. Bodaway rose from the fire and walked toward her. Eliza's heart seized. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He stopped before her, a towering silhouette against the dying fire. He did not speak. He simply reached down, took her arm, and pulled her to her feet. He led her to the simple bed built against the far wall, a sturdy frame covered in a mountain of soft furs. She trembled violently, her teeth chattering, a small, wounded sound in the immense silence of the cabin. This was the final violation, the ultimate act of conquest. What happened next was not the wild, brutal act of a savage she had imagined in her terror. It was something darker, stranger, and far more profound. As he laid her down upon the furs, his actions were deliberate, almost ceremonial. It was an act of possession, yes, but it was imbued with a solemn, terrifying gravity. It was as if he were performing a sacred rite, a vow made not in words but in flesh, in the dim firelit darkness of the cabin. He was not simply taking her body, he was claiming her spirit, branding her soul with his own. He was binding her to him, not as a captive, but as a fundamental part of his own existence. For Eliza, it was the final extinguishing of the world she had known, the girl who had laughed in the creek, who had dreamed of mountains, who had prayed in her father's house, died in that moment. It was a dark, silent passage, a terrifying sacrament she did not understand. As she lay trembling in the furs, the last of her strength gone, she felt not just the terror of her capture, but the profound, bewildering weight of his vow. He had taken her into his cabin, and in the deep silence of the wilderness, he had made her forever his. Eliza awoke to a world made of gray light and silence. For a blessed, fleeting moment, she didn't know where she was. She was simply a body, aching and heavy, adrift in a sea of soft furs. Then memory returned, not as a gentle tide, but as a brutal, crashing wave. The chase, the cabin, the darkness. A whimper escaped her lips, a small, wounded sound, and she curled into a tight ball, pulling the heavy pelts over her head, as if she could hide from the morning, from the truth. The truth was a cold, hard stone in her stomach. Her life was over. The world she knew, the scent of her mother's baking, the rough feel of her father's hand, the familiar cadence of their evening prayers was a universe away. She had been stolen, claimed, and irrevocably changed in the deep darkness of the night. A profound sense of violation and loss washed over her, so immense it left no room for tears, only a hollow, echoing emptiness. Anger was a spark somewhere in the void, a tiny point of heat, but it was smothered by the sheer weight of her despair. Slowly, the sounds of her new reality filtered through her cocoon of furs, the soft crackle of a newly kindled fire, the scrape of metal on stone as a coffee pot was set by the hearth, the quiet, almost imperceptible sound of a man moving about the room. Her captor bowed away. The name was a scar in her mind. She could not stay hidden forever. The need for air, the chill seeping into her bones, forced her to emerge. She sat up, clutching a buffalo robe to her chest like a shield, her eyes darting around the cabin. In the clear light of morning, the place was even more intimidating and contradictory than it had been in the firelight. The sunlight streamed through a single, small window high on the eastern wall, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a real home, solid and well kept. The weapons on the wall seemed less like trophies and more like tools, integral parts of the life lived here. The cabin was a testament to one man's absolute self-sufficiency. Bodaway was by the hearth, his back to her. He was tending to a small skillet, and the smell of sizzling bacon and hot coffee began to fill the room. The scent was painfully, bizarrely normal. It was the smell of any other morning, a domestic aroma that had no place in the heart of her nightmare. He moved with an unhurried, focused economy, a man completely at ease in his domain. He had not chained her. The door was barred, but within these four walls, She was not physically bound. The prison was the valley, the wilderness, and the man himself. He seemed to sense her gaze, for he turned his head slightly. He did not speak, but his eyes met hers for a long moment. There was no apology in his gaze, no cruelty, only a calm, possessive watchfulness. It was the look a man might give his land, his herd of horses, a thing of immense value that was now his to protect and command. Then he turned back to his cooking. The act was so mundane it was insane. It disarmed her. She had prepared herself for violence, for cruelty, for being treated like a slave. She had not prepared for breakfast. He portioned the food onto 2 wooden plates, placing them on the rough-hewn table in the center of the room. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups. Then he sat down on one of the stools and looked at her, a silent invitation. Rage, hot and sharp, finally pierced through her despair. How dare he? How dare he shatter her world and then expect her to sit and eat with him, as if this were a normal day? The injustice of it was a bitter acid in her throat. She stayed where she was, huddled in the furs, her chin held high in a small, trembling gesture of defiance. I will not eat his food. I will not drink his coffee. I will die first. Bodaway watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he began to eat his own meal. Slowly and deliberately. He did not coax her, or threaten her, or force her. He simply accepted her refusal and went about his business. His silence was a far more powerful tool than any command. It created a vacuum, a space in which her defiance had nothing to push against. It left her alone with her own raging emotions and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. The day crawled by in an agony of silence and tension. Eliza remained by the bed, a statue of misery. Bodaway moved in and out of the cabin. She heard him tending to his horses, the soft sound of his voice as he spoke to them in his own language, the rhythmic chop of an axe splitting firewood. He never strayed far. She knew, without having to look, that he was always aware of her, that the fortress was always guarded. Late in the afternoon, he came back inside and placed something on the heavy chest near the bed. He looked at her, then gestured toward the object with his chin before turning away to mend a piece of tack. Eliza stared at the offering. It was a set of clothes. They were not her practical, restrictive cotton dress. These were made of the softest, most supple buckskin, the color of rich cream. The tunic was simple but exquisitely made, decorated at the neck and sleeves with delicate patterns of colored beads. With it were a pair of leggings and soft moccasins that looked as if they would weigh nothing on her feet. She looked from the beautiful garments to her own dress, which lay in a heap on the floor where she had dropped it the night before. It was torn, stained with dirt and grass, a pathetic relic of a life that no longer existed. The sight of it filled her with a fresh wave of grief. But as she looked at the new clothes, a different, more complex feeling surfaced. They were beautiful. They were also utterly alien. To put them on would be an act of surrender, an acceptance of her new reality. It would be shedding the skin of Eliza Monroe and stepping into the identity of the Apache's woman. She refused. The anger returned, giving her strength. She would not wear his clothes. She would not become one of them. She wrapped the buffalo robe tighter around herself, her symbolic armor against his attempts to change her. Bodaway took no notice of her defiance. As dusk began to settle, he brought another visitor to the cabin. It was one of his own people, a tall, sinewy warrior with a stern face and questioning eyes. The man stopped dead in the doorway, his gaze fixing on Eliza, huddled in the corner. His eyes widened in shock, and he shot a look at Bodaway that was a mixture of disbelief and awe. The 2 men spoke in their own tongue, their voices low and guttural. Eliza could not understand the words, but she could read the tone. The visitor was asking questions, his gestures pointing toward her. Bodaway's answers were short, calm, and final. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man whose decisions were not to be questioned. As he spoke, He glanced at Eliza, and for the first time, she saw something new in his eyes. It was not just possession. It was a glimmer of pride. He was not hiding her. He was displaying her. The warrior's stern face eventually broke into a slow nod of understanding, of respect. He looked at Eliza one last time, his expression now one of curiosity, not hostility, and then he left. The encounter shook Eliza to her core. She had been seen, acknowledged. Her presence here was now a known fact in his world. She was not just a captive hidden in a cabin. She was a statement. The realization was terrifying. It meant her father's search parties, if they came, would not be looking for a lost girl, but for a woman taken by a powerful Apache. It made her rescue seem even more impossible. That night, he again offered her food, and again she refused. But as she lay in the furs, alone, her stomach twisted with hunger, her defiance began to feel foolish, self-destructive. What was she accomplishing? Starving herself would not bring her family back. It would only make her weaker, more helpless. It was a choice between dying on her own terms or living on his. The will to live, a stubborn, tenacious root deep within her, began to assert itself. Survival was the first, most basic law of this new world. The next morning, when he placed the plate of food on the table, she hesitated for only a moment. Then, with her heart hammering and her cheeks burning with shame and self-loathing, she rose from the furs, clinging to the wall for support, her injured ankles still tender. She limped to the table and sat down. She did not look at him. She stared at the plate, at the simple, life-sustaining food. She picked up the fork he had provided and took a bite. The taste was an explosion in her empty stomach, a confirmation that she had chosen life. It was a turning point, a small surrender, but a surrender nonetheless. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken routine. She began to eat. She began to move about the cabin. Exploring her cage, she discovered his world was one of intense discipline and order. Everything had a purpose, a place. There was no waste, no idleness. Life was a series of essential tasks, performed with quiet competence. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need to do something, to break the monotony, she picked up their empty plates and carried them to a basin of water. Her hands shook as she washed them. The simple, domestic act, a ghost of her old life. But it felt good to do something, to have a purpose, however small. Bodaway watched her from the doorway, his expression unreadable, but he did not stop her. He began to leave the cabin door open during the day. He was always nearby, watching from a distance as he worked with his horses. But the open door was a powerful symbol. It was a test, a grant of trust she had not earned. The first time she stepped outside, the brilliant sunlight and vast, open space of the valley were overwhelming. She saw his horses, magnificent animals that moved with a freedom she envied with every fiber of her being. One of the horses, a young mare as white as milk, watched her with intelligent, curious eyes. Tentatively, Eliza held out her hand. The mare shied away at first, then, encouraged by Bodaway's soft command from across the corral, she stepped closer, nudging Eliza's palm with her velvet nose. A connection, simple and pure, sparked between them. In the company of the horses, she found a small measure of peace. They did not judge her. They did not know her past or her future. They simply existed, beautiful and wild. She began to spend more time outside, helping with the horses. She brought them water, brushed their long manes, her movements growing more confident each day. She was learning. She was adapting. One morning, her old dress, which she had insisted on washing and mending, ripped beyond repair. She was left with nothing to wear but the bear skin or the clothes he had given her. With a sense of finality, of crossing a river from which there was no return, she put on the soft buckskin tunic. The fabric felt like a second skin. It was light, comfortable, and moved with her, not against her. When she put on the moccasins, she felt the earth beneath her feet in a way she never had before. She looked down at herself, at this new person in a savage's clothes. She should have felt shame, but instead, she felt a strange, unsettling sense of rightness. Her heart was still a battleground. At night, she would lie in the furs and weep for her family, for the girl she had been. The grief was a physical ache. She hated Bodaway for what he had stolen from her. But in the daylight, as she worked with the horses under the vast, blue sky, another feeling would whisper through her. She was not just a captive anymore. He provided for her, protected her, and in his silent, watchful way, he seemed to value her presence. He was teaching her a new way to live, a life of freedom and self-reliance she had secretly craved. The line between captive and chosen was becoming hopelessly, terrifyingly blurred. She was surviving, but it was becoming something more than survival. It was becoming a life. Weeks bled into a month, then 2. The sharp edges of Eliza's grief began to soften, not disappearing, but rounding into a familiar, constant ache, like a bone that had been broken and set crooked. The rhythm of her life was no longer dictated by the church bell or the list of chores on her mother's slate, but by the sun, the needs of the horses, and the silent, watchful presence of the man she now lived with. She had not spoken his name. He had not spoken hers. Words seemed to belong to the world she had lost. Their communication was one of gestures, of shared tasks, of glances that held more weight than 1,000 sentences. She learned the language of the valley. She knew the cry of the hawk that nested in the high cliffs meant a rabbit was careless in the meadow. She could read the tension in the horse's ears that spoke of a distant mountain lion. She learned to bake flat, unleavened bread on a hot stone in the fire and to find the wild onions that grew by the creek. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and capable in a new way. Her skin, once fair, was now kissed by the sun, a healthy, golden tan. She moved with a new confidence, her body strong and limber in the supple buckskin that was now her only attire. But her heart remained a divided territory. In the quiet moments, gazing at the distant line of mountains that separated her from her past, she would be ambushed by memories, the scent of her mother's rosewater, the sound of her father reading from the Bible, his voice a low, rumbling comfort, the simple, earnest face of Silas Blackwood. Guilt would rise in her then, hot and sharp. She had been taken, yes, but she had not died. She had survived. She had adapted. And a part of her, a secret, treacherous part, was beginning to find a strange and powerful peace in this wild, silent world. She found it in the morning, when Bodaway would hand her a hot tin cup of coffee, their fingers brushing, a simple, shared ritual in the stillness before sunrise. She found it in the afternoon, when she would race the white mare across the valley floor, the wind whipping through her unbound hair, a feeling of exhilarating freedom she had only ever dreamed of. And she found it in his eyes. He would watch her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, and in his gaze, she saw not the savage from her nightmares, but something else, a deep, unwavering possessiveness, yes, but also a quiet reverence, as if he were looking at something precious, something he had waited his entire life to find. He had taken her, but he also cherished her. He had imprisoned her, but he had also set a part of her free. The contradiction was a constant, bewildering turmoil in her soul. The end of her quiet, conflicted world came on a day like any other. The sky was a vast, cloudless blue, and the sun was warm on her back as she groomed the white mare in the corral. Bodaway was on the far side of the valley, checking a line of snares. Suddenly, the mare's head shot up, her ears swiveling, her body going rigid. The other horses echoed the alarm, their soft nickering turning into anxious snorts. Eliza froze, her hand still on the curry comb. She listened, her senses now as honed as any creature of the wild. And then she heard it, A sound that did not belong. It was not the wind, or an animal, or the distant rumble of thunder. It was the rhythmic, metallic clink of horseshoes on rock, and the murmur of men's voices. It was the sound of the world she had left behind. Bodaway appeared as if from the earth itself, moving with a silent, lethal speed. He was at her side in an instant, his face a mask of grim, focused intensity. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the narrow entrance to the valley. "Inside," he said. His voice was a low command, the first word he had spoken to her in weeks. Fear, cold and familiar, washed over her. But it was different now. It was not just for herself. She looked at him, at the way his hand had instinctively gone to the knife at his belt, at the warrior who had been dormant beneath the surface, now fully awake and ready for battle. She ran to the cabin, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. From the small window, she saw them, a dozen riders, emerging from the trees at the mouth of the valley, and in the lead, a figure that made her world tilt on its axis, her father, Jedediah Monroe. He was riding his sturdy plow horse, a long rifle held across his saddle. Behind him were other men she knew, Mr. Blackwood and his sons, Silas among them, their faces grim and set. They were a posse, a righteous army of settlers, come to reclaim what was theirs. Bodaway did not take cover. He walked to the center of the clearing in front of his cabin and stood there, a solitary, defiant figure. He held his Winchester rifle loosely in one hand, its barrel pointed at the ground. He was not an aggressor, but he was an immovable object, a guardian at the gate of his kingdom. The riders drew to a halt 100 feet away, their horses shifting and blowing nervously, sensing the tension in the air. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the jingle of bridles. "Eliza!" Her father's voice boomed across the clearing, raw with a mixture of hope and fury. "Eliza, child, are you in there?" Eliza's breath caught in her throat, the sound of his voice. The word child, it shattered the fragile peace she had built. She was no longer the woman who rode the white mare. She was a child again, her father's daughter, lost and in need of rescue. "Come out, Eliza," he roared. "We've come to take you home." She was paralyzed. A war erupted inside her, so violent it made her physically sick. Home. The word was a magnet, pulling at her soul, her mother, her bed, her Bible, the simple, ordered life that she knew. It was safety. It was salvation. But as she looked out at the hard, angry faces of the men, at their rifles, she felt a sickening dread. They saw only a savage who had stolen a white woman. They did not see the man who had tended her injuries, who had combed her hair, who had shared his fire with her. They did not see the world he had shown her, a world of harshness, yes, but also of a profound, untamed beauty. Bodaway turned his head and looked at her, his eyes locking with hers through the window. He saw the conflict tearing her apart. He saw the pull of her old life. He walked to the cabin door, unbarred it, and pushed it open. He stood on the threshold, then stepped aside, clearing the way. He was not going to hold her. The choice had to be hers. "Step away from the door, you heathen," Jedediah bellowed, raising his rifle. Bodaway ignored him. His gaze remained fixed on Eliza. She could feel the intensity of it, a physical force. He was willing her to stay, to choose this life, to choose him. She saw him glance at his weapons on the wall, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that if she did not come out, he would fight for her. He would fight all of them, and he would likely die. Right here, in the dirt, in front of the fortress he had built. The thought of his death was a physical pain, a sharp, unexpected agony in her chest. Trembling, she stepped into the doorway, blinking in the bright sunlight. She was framed there, a figure caught between two worlds, dressed in the buckskin of the Apache, her hair unbound, her feet in moccasins. A collective gasp went through the riders. Silas Blackwood's face went white with shock and horror. Her father's face crumpled, the fury replaced by a look of profound, heart-wrenching pain. He saw not his daughter, but a creature that had been corrupted, defiled. "Oh, Lord in heaven," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What has he done to you, child?" He swung down from his horse, his movements stiff with age and grief. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched, his eyes pleading. "Eliza, come home. Come away from him. We can fix this. We can pray. It's not too late. Come home." Home. The word was a siren's call. She looked at her father's outstretched hand, the hand that had held hers when she was a child, the hand that had built the house she grew up in. Love, powerful and deep, surged through her, a lifetime of it. She took a hesitant step forward, onto the packed earth in front of the cabin, then another. She was leaving. She was going home. The relief was so immense it made her dizzy. Bodaway did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched her go, his face carved from stone, his eyes holding a universe of something she could not name. As she took another step, his voice, low and intense, cut through the air, meant only for her. "You are home." The words stopped her dead. They were not a plea. They were a statement of fact, as solid and real as the mountains around them. Asterisk, you are home. She looked back at him, standing in the shadow of the cabin, the fortress that had been her prison and had become her sanctuary. She looked at the wild, beautiful valley that had become her world. And she looked at the man who had taken her, but who had also seen her, the real her, the secret self that had yearned for the wildness he embodied. He had not tried to tame her, to put her in a box of duty and expectation. He had simply made a place for her untamed spirit to live alongside his. Her father called her name again, his voice thick with tears. "Eliza, please." She turned back to him, and the tears that had been blurring her vision finally fell. She was weeping for him, for her mother, for the life she was about to lose forever. The choice was a physical severing, a cutting of the cord that bound her to her past. She took a step back, away from her father, then another, her moccasins soft on the dirt. She walked back to the cabin, back to the silent Apache who stood waiting. She stopped beside him, so close their arms were touching. She did not look at him, but at her father, her gaze clear and steady through her tears. She reached out and took Bodaway's hand, her fingers lacing through his hand, strong and warm, closed around hers. A silent, absolute acceptance. "He took me," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent clearing. "But now I choose him." Eliza's words hung in the still, sunlit air, as clear and final as the crack of a rifle. "But now I choose him." For a long moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. The posse of settlers sat frozen on their horses, their faces a mixture of disbelief, outrage, and profound confusion. They had come to rescue a damsel, a victim of a savage raid. They had found a queen standing by her king's side. The silence was broken by a sound of pure agony. It was a low, guttural noise that was ripped from Jedediah Monroe's soul. He stared at his daughter, at her hand held firmly in the Apache's, at the strange, beautiful buckskin clothes she wore, at the defiant and sorrowful clarity in her eyes. The woman standing before him was a stranger. He saw the physical shell of his Eliza, but the spirit within was one he no longer recognized. It was a spirit that had been forged in a fire he could not comprehend. His outstretched hand, the hand that had pleaded for her return, fell slowly to his side, the rifle in his other hand, which had been a symbol of his righteous fury, now seemed to be an impossibly heavy burden. With a gesture of utter defeat, he lowered the barrel until it pointed at the dusty earth. It was a surrender, not to the warrior before him, but to a truth so painful he could barely comprehend it. His daughter was lost to him. not by capture, but by choice. He looked at her one last time, his face a mask of brokenness. The stern, God-fearing man who had carved a life from the wilderness was gone. In his place was an old, grieving father who had just witnessed the death of his own heart. Without another word, he turned, his movements stiff and clumsy, and walked back to his horse. He pulled himself into the saddle with the weary slowness of a man who had aged a lifetime in a single afternoon. Silas Blackwood stared at Eliza, his mouth agape, his kind, simple face a canvas of betrayal and horror. This was the woman he was to have married, the future mother of his children. He saw her now as something tainted, an alien creature who had willingly chosen the darkness. He spat on the ground, a gesture of disgust and finality, and wrenched his horse's head around. The other men, murmuring amongst themselves, followed suit. They had come for a fight, for a righteous crusade. There was nothing for them here but a mystery that unsettled them to their core. They turned their horses and rode away. A somber, defeated procession. They left the valley in silence. Their departure a funeral march for a girl they had once known. Eliza and Bodaway stood together, their hands still clasped, and watched until the last rider had disappeared into the trees. Only then did the strength that had held Eliza upright finally desert her. A deep, shuddering sob escaped her, and the tears she had held back now flowed freely, hot and bitter. She wept for her father's broken face, for her mother's grief which she could only imagine, for the irrevocable severing of every tie that had once bound her to her world. She had made her choice, and the cost of it was everything she had ever known. Bodaway did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort that he did not possess. He simply stood beside her, his presence a solid, unshakable anchor in the storm of her grief. He tightened his grip on her hand, a silent acknowledgement of her sacrifice, a promise that she was not alone in the new world she had chosen. When her sobs finally began to subside, he gently turned her and led her back toward the cabin. As they stepped across the threshold, the feeling of the space was different. It was no longer her prison, or his fortress. The heavy bar on the door, which had once seemed a symbol of her captivity, now felt like a necessary shield against a world that would not understand. The fire in the hearth, the soft furs on the bed, the scent of smoke and herbs. These were the elements of a shared life. The cabin, which had once echoed with his solitude and her despair, was now filled with a new, profound silence. It was the quiet of a shared destiny, the beginning of a home. That night, as they lay in the furs, he did something he had never done before. He gently brushed the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it made her breath catch in her throat. The fierce, solitary warrior had a softness to him, a current of gentleness that ran deep beneath the surface, a current that she, and only she, was now allowed to see. The man who had been a legend, a force of nature, was becoming a partner, a man who had found a reason to be gentle. The empty space in his soul, the one he had carried for so long, was now filled. And in that moment, Eliza understood the finality of her own transformation. The timid, dutiful girl who had hidden her dreams of freedom was gone forever. In her place was a woman who had faced the ultimate choice and had not flinched. She had looked into the heart of her own fear and had found the courage to claim her own life. She had lost a family, but she had found herself, lying there in the quiet darkness. She felt the last vestiges of the captive fall away, replaced by the profound, peaceful certainty of a woman who was exactly where she was meant to be. The next morning, Bodaway led her out into the bright sunlight. He walked her to the corral, where the horses were grazing peacefully. The white mare, her coat shimmering like new-fallen snow, lifted her head and trotted over, nudging Eliza's shoulder with her soft nose. Bodaway untied the mare's lead rope from the fence post. He coiled it neatly, then held it out to Eliza. She looked at him, confused. He gestured with his chin, a silent command for her to take it. Hesitantly, she reached out and took the rope. The leather was warm and smooth in her hand. He looked from the horse to her, and then out at the vast, open expanse of the valley. He spoke, his voice low and clear. He did not use the few English words he knew, but his own tongue, the language of the mountains and the wind. She did not understand the literal meaning of the words, but she understood their heart. He was not giving her a possession. He was giving her a symbol of her own spirit, wild, beautiful, and free. The mare was not his to give, but hers to ride. It was an acknowledgement of her freedom, a final, definitive statement that their bond was not one of captor and captive, but of two souls belonging to each other. And to this land, she looked at the beautiful animal, then back at the man standing beside her, a slow, genuine smile, the first she had truly felt since the day by the creek, spread across her face. She looped the rope over the mare's neck and, with a practiced grace she had not possessed months ago, she swung herself onto the horse's bare back. From her new vantage point, she could see the whole valley laid out before her. The red rock cliffs glowed in the morning sun. The creek was a ribbon of silver, and the cabin sat nestled in the trees, a plume of smoke rising from its chimney. It was not the world she had been born into, but it was the world she had chosen. It was a harsh and unforgiving land, but it was also a place of breathtaking beauty and profound freedom. Bodaway looked up at her, a rare, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. In his eyes, she saw a deep, burning pride. He had not conquered her. He had won her. He had waited his entire life for a destiny he couldn't imagine. And now, here it was, more real and more powerful than he had ever dreamed. This was not a simple story of a girl who was taken. It was the story of a woman who chose. It was the story of how love, in its wildest and most unexpected form, can forge a new path, breaking down the fences of prejudice and fear. It was the story of two solitary souls who, in the heart of the unforgiving West, found their home not in a place, but in each other. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales. Give this video a like, and show your support by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.